You know, it's not so many years since he drove down here, and the cutting rang to the sound of steel on steel. Not so many years, and yet it seems half a century ago. The cutting is quiet now, and an old man can wander through it and see the signs of the not so long ago. And he can remember.
Because the life of a tram car is practically endless. In fact, to get rid of ours, we had to burn them. There were great crowds that came here from it was really the beach for the northern suburbs. And we ran services from everywhere to Balmoral. And we would have as many as on the return trip. There would be perhaps 50, 60 trams to leave within an hour.
The death of a tramway is somehow sad, but the funeral procession can be pretty merry. You might even have been at this one, the last journey from Sydney to La Perouse. And if you weren't there, you must have been one of the few who missed the big occasion. There wasn't even standing room. In Sydney, the first tram in Pitt Street began its first trip in 1861 from Circular Quay to the railway. It was popular enough, except with storekeepers and drivers of other vehicles. They protested so vehemently that it lasted only 5 years, and then the tracks were pulled up. Some of the early trams were double-deckers, and the first of them were all horse-drawn. Steam motors were imported about 1880, but until they arrived, and indeed for some years later, the horsepower really was horsepower.
When I was a boy going to school, the steam tram ran along Oxford Street, down Queen Street, and down Ocean Street, and terminated at the old council chambers. First of all, when they started the steam trams, I can recollect when they only used coke. And of course coke was very clean and there was no dirty smoke and grime coming back onto the passengers who were seated in the cars at the rear. I was attached to Fort Macquarie Depot, and we ran a service of trams to the old Redfern railway station. Of course there was a huge horse cabs down there as well, but as I'm going in there I noticed crossing George Street that a horse had fallen for some reason or other, and the man had fallen out as well, out of a delivery van. And when the horse got to his feet, there was a lady passing, and her dress somehow or other got caught in the shafts, and this lady was standing there with her dress all under the garments were exposed. And I ran across and released the lady's dress, and of course there was a cheers from the few people who were around.
By the mid-80s, though, steam had taken over. This line ran through Cogra, and if the rush of modern traffic worries you, look back with envy to the more sedate and leisurely days. There was even time to stop on the way to call in at the butcher's. These were the good old days, before everyone began to shoot through like a Bondi.
Manly originally had steam trams before ever they had the horse trams. When it first started, it ran from the Corso, from the boat up the Corso, and along the ocean beach, and then to the North Stane, and that was the route which afterwards was altered.
While authorities were trying to work out whether steam would replace the horse, tramway men had grievances too. So what did they do? Of course they did. And Sydney had its first tram strike.
The tram strike took place, of course, in the morning. It was the first that they'd ever had, and the trams were piled up everywhere. There was a bit of a scene outside Anthony Horton's. The newspaper people made the most of it, and it showed a picture of their new shop with all this enormous crowd around there waiting to get into Horton's.
But even steam was on the way up. The last steam tram from Parramatta Park to Redbank Wharf was taken off in 1941, but it had only been kept going as a tourist attraction. Electricity had come to the inner city in 1899 and to the nearer suburbs in the first few years of the 1900s. Cable trams began in 1894, and the service from King Street to Woollahra ran every 3 minutes. It was quite a service, and the fare from King Street to Ocean Street, Woollahra, was just threepence. The cable cars were cumbersome, and huge drums had to be installed to draw them. But where gradients were too steep for the steam trams, cable cars were essential. And before long, there was another service north of the harbour, covering North Sydney and Crow's Nest. It's interesting to note that Sydney had nearly 40 miles of tramways before the turn of the century. There were 114 steam motors in addition to the cable cars and horse-drawn trams. The cable cars, though, was something special.
I was very familiar with the King Street cable when it was introduced first. I was asked would I like to go for a ride, and I went up on this tram, of course rode on the cable. Later on, of course that was the best part of the cable tram to get on, because, and it was a place that was very much sought after always.
Melbourne, unlike Sydney, went in for cable trams in a big way. In fact, by 1885, it had the fourth largest cable tram system in the world, 43.5 miles of it. And many of the cable trams were still running in the 1920s, even though electricity had been adopted by some suburban tramway trusts many years earlier. The Box Hill and Doncaster line, which opened in 1889, was the first electric tramway operating in Australia. But this venture into electricity had only mixed success, and the line closed down 5 years later. Still, it was a start. And in those days, there were hazards which made things rather difficult. In Sydney, the first electric line opened in 1899. It ran from Circular Quay along George Street to the railway and on to Piermont. Electric tram services had come to some suburbs 6 years earlier, despite letters to the newspapers protesting that this newfangled electricity shouldn't be tampered with.
They experimented first from Randwick to Charing Cross, Waverley, with the electric, number 1, 2 and 3. Now, number 1 and 2 were built in the United States. Number 3 was built locally. One of the lines we used to drive on was from Circular Quay along Elizabeth Street and along Cleveland Street, and terminating right opposite the showground and the zoo. And at night time, several of the animals would get free. And one particular night, when going along, there was a kangaroo in front, and of course I kept behind him and just rattled the handbrake and kicked the bell slightly, and this thing kept hopping all the way along in front of my tram till we came to Elizabeth Street. When we came to Elizabeth Street, the Zetland tram crossed there, and just as we got there, the driver was just going across, and of course that upset the calculations of the kangaroo, and he went out till we lost him. Then he went out in the wilds of Waterloo.
Kangaroos weren't the only worry. In Brisbane, the trams had trouble even on excursions where everything should have gone swimmingly. Brisbane, incidentally, began its tramway system in 1885 and began to electrify it 12 years later. Across Bass Strait, the Tasmanians stuck rigidly to the English-style trams, and the double-deckers were a familiar sight, even if other vehicles did find them a nuisance. But then trams were never popular with other drivers, were they? Well, that's how it all started, just about the time Mr. Richmond was born. He's still going strong, but the old trams have gone. And in some cities, like Sydney, the trams have gone altogether. Yes, they've gone, but you should have seen them in their heyday in the 20s.
We catered for people who took their pets out to the showground, and the trams went from Circular Quay to the railway, and from the railway it went out to the showground. And whatever the normal adult fare was, you paid. The attendant himself paid a double fare. And then, of course, the cars were taken out, the trams were taken out and fumigated, of course, as soon as it was over. But they would bring those people back again at night time.
Back in the 20s, a car was a real status symbol. If you wanted to go anywhere, with the family, of course, you took a tram. Remember those Easter holidays at the show? It was a battle, but you made it, and you made it home, too. Even if the kids were screaming and their faces were sticky from fairy floss. Then, of course, there was a day at the races. The trams used to drive right into the course.
There was a wonderful system. You could get a tram from the racecourse to any part. All the suburbs were catered for. We would be practically tram to tram, all the way from the race course or the showground to Circular Quay. You paid extra, your red carpet through the trams, and they charged extra for that. And they were called first class, and you paid the higher price to enter the race course.
Without cars to get you off the beaten track in those days, you went where the trams went. And naturally enough, everyone else went with you. Oh, sure, it was crowded, but was it any worse than being bumper to bumper in a long line of cars? Let's say it was different anyway. Along Anzac Parade, the trams had a clear go, and they really went. In fact, they shot through like a Bondi.
Well, that, of course, originated in the early days, long before my days, when they used to run steam trams, and I don't think they stopped anywhere. And they would ride on the tram that never stopped, and just eased up at the different stops for them to get off. Well, at Harperoo's, there was a picnic sort of a ground where the children were catered for by having camel rides. Evidently, these camels came from out west. This one must have strayed away, and he got on the Harperoo's line, and as the tram's going along, it was a very dark line there at all times, and the camel got hit, and naturally, as far as he was concerned, that was his exit.
By the 20s, the sedate old days had disappeared. It was all rush and bustle, and no one could wait, even for the trams to stop. Oh well, first aboard gets the best seat. But in this mad helter-skelter of people, and the equally crowded jam of trams, how did the intrepid passenger know he was jumping onto the running board of the tram that was going to take him where he wanted to go?
Well, that was really purely an Australian invention, and it was takeover from the old steam trains. Well, you could see, if you saw a tram coming along in the dark, it would have the coloured lights. Waverley would have all red, square. Bondi would have one red, and so on.
The big rush, naturally enough, was at the key points of the city, Central Railway and Circular Quay. But across the harbour, there were services too. There's still a monument at the spit to remind people of the trams that used to run to Manly and along the northern beaches to Narrabeen. Those trams have gone. Even the cuttings they ran through have changed. And after a few years, nobody misses them. Except, of course, the people like Mr. Richmond, to whom a tram was more than mere transport, more than a steel trolley running wherever the rails would lead. Across the harbour, there was land for sale in streets and roads where homes and home units now sit cheek by jowl. Enterprising estate agents saw that the trams would bring more people and bring people closer to the city. They were right. The people and the houses are still there, and the trams have gone.
They were eventually electrified to the spit. So Manly had never been a paying proposition. It was an isolated place, but it served a tremendous amount of convenience for the public. The system was there complete to start with the buses, and I think that was why they started first.
Yes, big changes were on the way. Already buses were beginning to encroach on the tram's domain. From Manly Wharf, you could take either. Narrabeen was the end of the line. After that, it was buses all the way. The harbour was a barrier. Whenever a tram had to be overhauled, it was a major operation to take it to the city depots. But they overcame the problem this way.
Well, there's a punt, a special punt was built, and this punt, it could be raised or lowered according to the tide. They would drive the trams on and drive them off again. And all trams were taken from Manly for what they call a number 1 overhaul at North Sydney.
But the harbour was not to isolate north from south for very much longer, and the trams would run across, on rails, across the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Going over the bridge was a novelty. At last, the two sides of the city had been joined, and everyone wanted to see what it was like to ride from one side to the other.
But that was a very, very big day. We've made all sorts of preparations, naturally, but the best plans of everybody goes astray, and there was a greater interest taken than anybody thought. The department arranged for trams to go to Ernest Street and Ridge Street and to shunt, because the people didn't want to go that far. They just simply got off. Just had to improvise straight away, and we managed to get quite a number of trams to just run across the bridge and back again. The most tiring day, both mentally and physically, that I ever put in on my 44 years service with the tramways.
There were 2 lanes for the trams across the bridge, and they went through an underground tunnel to Wynyard. For the first time in Sydney's history, Circular Quay had been isolated. The trams had replaced the punt and the ferry. It's the 30s now, and the tram is king. Mile upon mile of track, services running north, south, east and west. The iron rails lead everywhere. The trams took people to the beaches. But there was rough weather ahead. Sometimes it seemed that the trams knew that they were doomed, and certainly a few on the Athol run seemed to have had a kind of death wish.
Mainly it was the oil from the leaves would get on the tram line. We had at Wilson's Point 2 boys, they were called sand boys, and their job was to go with a water can and ride down with you and put the sand on the rail. We did have a runaway there one time.
Into the harbour or onto the scrap heap, it made no difference. In Sydney, the trams had had their day. Horses had given way to steam and steam to electricity. And now diesel oil has taken over and the trams are burned as buses rule the roads. Some trams live to run again in the United States, but the market for old trams is pretty restricted. These are just lucky to survive. Melbourne, with streets much wider than Sydney's, has sometimes talked of switching to buses, but the tramways are still supreme. Underground tramways have been suggested too, even if the anti-tram brigade does say trams should go underground permanently. Brisbane maintains its tramways, an efficient service which has won wide public support. The Brisbane and Melbourne tramcars are modern and comfortable, and they're capable of moving large numbers of people in a short time. But all Australia's trams aren't modern. Bendigo and Ballarat still have these trams in service, the oldest in Australia. It's like a page from the past, but you'll have to admit it does have a certain charm. Like most other mechanical monsters, trams have always presented problems. And if it's not the trams themselves, it's often a stubborn set of points along the line. The devoted tramway man is not only reluctant to see trams disappear, he does something about it. And a few Sydney trams still live here in the Tramway Museum at Loftus. It's by no means a graveyard, and on Sunday afternoons, when it's open to the public, it's just like the old days again. For Sydney's younger generation, it's their only chance to see a tram, unless trams make a comeback. But even Mr. Richmond doesn't think that's the way to solve Sydney's traffic problems.
Now what they should do is to go ahead and build the underground railway, the eastern suburbs, and the railway to Narrabeen and Palm Beach and all the rest of it. I think that is a solution. And then the buses, in place of coming into the city, I'm speaking from North Sydney now, could all go to and terminate at a railway station. And there would not be all that traffic over the bridge and through the city.
So, Sydney's trams have gone. And perhaps all we have to remember them by is an expression which has become part of our national language. They shot through like a Bondi.